Welcome to the Lighthouse Conversations. I'm Hasham Montasir. When we started our podcast, our idea was to explore topics of interest with entrepreneurs and tastemakers from the world of arts, culture, tech, and food. Actually, this was an extension of a 3-year-old tradition of having physical conversations at the Lighthouse in Dubai Design District. So a couple of weeks ago, we went back to our roots, so to speak, and sat down with UAE Minister of State Zaki Nusseibeh to talk about arts and culture, him being our first live conversation since launching the podcast. Zaki is a polyglot, a voracious reader, and an art collector way before art collecting was fashionable. So in many ways, he's a true Renaissance man. The last time I met Zaki, we had lunch at the Lighthouse shortly after we opened 3 years ago, and he told me about his childhood in Jerusalem and the various journeys him and his siblings chartered in their lives, and I was instantly hooked. Zaki was born in Jerusalem to a renowned family that's considered the closest to Palestinian royalty. In fact, his ancestors accompanied the first caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, to Jerusalem over 1500 years ago during the Arab Islamic capture of the city. He remembers the city being incredibly tolerant during his childhood.
I was at a school called St. George's, which is an Anglican church school, and it had its choir at school. And it was in an environment where you didn't know what religion was. We knew we were Muslims. We had friends who were Christian, who were Jewish, who were different sects of Islam and Christianity. But having a friend sit next to you at school called Salim or Ali or Basim, you really didn't know whether he was Christian or Muslim, and it never came into our minds. So this was the kind of spirit of the place. But again, because of the churches that it has, because of the mosques, of course, the Dome of the Rock, the Masjid al-Aqsa, the Aqsa Mosque, there was a lot of music in those days, the music that you heard in the churches, again, in the choirs, but also a number of active cultural centers for the foreign embassies or consulates that were in Jerusalem that brought concerts to Jerusalem. I remember, as an example, the British Council in those days, and unfortunately it stopped doing it, used to have libraries. And you used to go and be able to get books to read, because books were not easy to have access to in those days. And I remember one of the first things I saw there as a film, black and white, was Great Expectations, and it blew my mind as a young boy. So the family, we grew up there. I went to school in England, and then 67, the war of 67, I couldn't go back to Jerusalem, so I came to Abu Dhabi, but that's a whole story.
And all your siblings, most of you went to different places.
So my younger brothers were still studying. They went on studying for a while. In fact, in all of my brothers got scholarships from Sheikh Zayed, with whom I was working. So my family, in a way, was taken over by Sheikh Zayed here in Abu Dhabi. And then they did different things. So I had a brother who came, two of them came to work here, one in oil, one in government relations, who then went back to do the PhD in Islamic philosophy. And then went back to Jerusalem, established the Arab University of Jerusalem, and still lives there. Another brother came here again to work with an oil company, then went with Total, and he actually became a French citizen and a general manager or president of Total. And then he settled in Paris, and he lives now between Paris and Abu Dhabi, and he's retired. But a third brother actually studied Islamic philosophy for his PhD and then became a banker. And when he became a banker like you, an investment banker,
ex-banker now,
I told him many years ago, why did you choose banking? He said, because I knew that you are in London, you're going to ask me, what job do you want me to look for you for? And I had looked in the Times supplement that morning, and I saw that a teacher at Oxford University earned £7,000 a year, but a banker earned 12,000.
He's right.
So he went into banking. Then he settled into London, actually, in London, married and lives in London. So as a family, yes, we are spread out. I have also two sisters, lived both of them in Jordan. One of them an artist who went to New York, lived in New York, came back. Another sister who settled now in Jordan. So it's a spread out family.
So when we were making choices about your own career, obviously, did this family history in any way impact that your choices? Because you had obviously many choices. You came to Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi was wide open at the time, and you had a number of options, but you pursued the options you did. Explain to us a little bit, did the family history part impact you, or were you very clear from the beginning about the choice you wanted to make?
No, I think it's family history, to a large extent, because we have always been either government or academic or judges or lawyers or government civil servants. My father was the ambassador in London. He was minister. So, I mean, to that extent, that for me, it was somewhere there, my interest. But in fact, from very young, from that very day, I went to the British Council and saw Great Expectations in black and white. And then I read the novels of Georges Zidane, I remember as a young boy. You know, Georges Zidane is an Arab author who's written a series of history books. He's almost like a Sir Walter Scott. And it's all based on Islamist Arabic history, recounting Harun al-Rashid, the assassins, but always in an amazing, with amazing facility. And I loved it. I mean, I loved reading. And then, of course, the poetry. We at school, St. George's, we used to have a teacher who is the best teacher we ever did have, who taught us Arabic, modern, romantic poetry. And so, I mean, that was always reading books.
And the poetry came back in your life later on because
It
you
really, yes,
translated, some poetry and
yes. I mean, poetry has been from the outset one of my great passions. And I think with our Arab heritage, for us, poetry is something that is embedded in our DNA. I mean, we enjoy poetry. I know that Sheikh Zayed, for instance, who never did have any formal education, in fact, had learned classical Arab heritage through the poetry of the great Jahiliyyah poet. Al-Mutanabbi, he used to quote Al-Mutanabbi extensively and ask us about the meaning of words. I mean, he tested us to see who knew which word. So that was, I mean, when I came out because of the Six-Day War, because my parents had gone back to Jerusalem, and because of the war, I could not go back. And we had a relationship with the Emirates. My father knew both Sheikh Shakhbout and Sheikh Zayed. He'd received, in fact, when I was still at Cambridge in England, Sheikh Zayed was in London in the summer before he became ruler, and he came to dinner in the embassy residence in London, and I met him. But I had
through your
no
father
idea, yeah, through the father. But I had no idea
that you would be
that
there.
my life, my destiny is going to be in Abu Dhabi. But in '67, after it was June that I came down, as they say, the war had broken up. So my father said, why not go to Abu Dhabi? We had a company here that was just about opening because Sheikh Zayed had just become a ruler. He was developing some major contracts in Abu Dhabi. And they said, go out and try your luck. I came, but did not really feel attracted
To that
to
job.
working in contracting or accounting or selling iron rods. And so I drifted into journalism.
I was going to say, so you started with journalism.
I drifted into journalism. You know, in those days, there was one hotel called the Beach Hotel. It was the only place in town which was a watering.
The Sheraton now, or what?
It's the Sheraton
Yeah.
Place Hotel now.
Yeah.
And it the only place that had air conditioning. I mean, we used to live in prefabricated kind of units, sometimes had electricity, often not, even in summer. But the hotel was the only place that had both electricity, air conditioning, and company. And in those days, a lot of editors, foreign editors, Arab editors, were passing through Abu Dhabi because they were interested in two things. One was to see what are the new economic big projects that Sheikh Zayed is going to announce. And so that was big news internationally. But also because they were worried once Britain announced that it will withdraw from the Gulf,
There'll be a vacuum,
that there will be
essentially.
a power vacuum,
Yeah.
and therefore a security issue. And they wanted to cover what was happening, but it was not important enough to have reporters actually resident in Abu Dhabi. So it was natural to ask me to become a stringer, which means you write a story. If they publish it, they pay you per
Okay.
piece. And I remember, for instance, the first piece I did was about Abu Dhabi's 5-year plan, 68 to 72. I sent it to the Financial Times. I got £10, which was a lot of money in those days. But also, you could rewrite that story into 4 or 5 different forms
Uh-huh.
and then send it to Agence France Presse and to Reuters and to The
So
Economist.
it's not just your brother, the banker, that knew how to make money
A
through.
little to survive. I mean, in those
Right.
days, it was survival.
And did you feel that the way you were covering the stories as an Arab and someone that grew up in the region was different than some of those foreign correspondents, or not correspondents at the time, but that came and told a similar story, for example, about the
Because
5-year plan?
Yes, because I mean, I got very rapidly to know everybody because in those days, Abu Dhabi was a small village, really, by the sea, and the decision makers were few in numbers. And it was enough to say, I am Financial Times, and all doors would open to you. And then I met everyone within a month or two. And of course, living there, knowing the history, before going out, and from the time that I met Sheikh Zayed in London, I mean, I was obviously fascinated by the man and his history, and I had started even then to read a lot of the books about the region, Arabian Sand, Wilfred Thesiger, The Golden Bubble. I mean, there are a number of books that I read. And so when I came out, I was well introduced both to the region, its history, the tribal history, the stories of Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the Emirates, and I found it all fascinating.
Was there documentation and writing that was coming from the region? I mean, I'm just contrasting growing up in Egypt and remembering I started reading some parts of the especially more modern history of Egypt only when I left. I went to the States because in Egypt you had very particular and subjective kind of coverage. I'm not saying outside it wasn't subjective, but it didn't exist. Did you experience something similar at
Well,
the time?
there was very little that was written from this region. So almost immediately I became Sheikh Zayed's interpreter in 1968, and then media director. And one of the first things we had to do is to go and find the history so that we can publish it as a
Right.
department of information. And of course, then you had to go to the Lorimer gazetteers, you had to go to the British documents to start finding
The archives.
the archives about the tribal history and then to revise them. You see, there was a lot of oral history then. So we had to go and research the actual archival history, then come to Sheikh Zayed, and this is the Department of Information, and actually work out what was factual and what was not. And so a lot of the work we did in those years, early days, I remember, was researching the
Documentation, essentially.
history and publishing them as publications of the Department of Information. And in those days, we had to go to Beirut to do everything. You know, if you needed publishing,
To publish because there were no printing
there
presses,
was
of
no
course,
print.
here.
I mean, I remember when we started our first Arabic newspaper, Al Ittihad, we would assemble photographs, articles, then send them to Beirut so that they're printed there, then wait for the Middle East airline to bring them back. And so the newspaper came initially in two editions a week. It was a bi-weekly. And the first English newspaper I started, called Abu Dhabi News, was
Here.
once a week here, and
What
then
year
it
was that?
became Emirates News. It was 69 or so.
And it was a general newspaper covering various.
But I mean, few pages and covering. It was really still then elementary kind of journalism, and then of course that developed over the years.
Let me transition for a minute here. Talk just about your interest in art. So that's you have a multi-decade relationship with art that's in some cases well told before, but I'm interested in your particular relationship with art because it's not only just collecting art. I mean, obviously that's one aspect that you enjoy. And we just talked now, we were talking about, for example, some of your pieces from your collection that were exhibited in NYU Abu Dhabi as part of one of the professor's curated exhibition for his students. So your relationship with art goes beyond collecting into, what is it? Is it the learning? Is it the interacting with it? What draws your interest
You
here?
know, I love the German language, and the Germans have a real knack to put words together. They build a word out of three different words to give the full meaning of what they want to say. And I love one of the words that is a compound word is what Richard Wagner, as an opera composer, described his operas, and he called it a Gesamtkunstwerk, which really means a whole art work.
I want to say, sorry, I went to German school, so I can verify it's correct.
So a Gesamtkunstwerk, what he wanted to say by that is that he's not just composing an opera, he's not just composing music, he's not just he's actually writing poetry, he's a philosopher. I mean, this is how he saw his work. And for me, if I am to invent and became Gesamtkunstwerk became accepted in English language as a kind of term in the aesthetics of a whole work that brings in different aspects, and not only just one aspect. And to me, if I want to describe my relationship with art, I would call it a Gesamtkunsterfahrung, which means experience. It's really the experience is not just one side of it, one aspect of it. So clearly, it's everything that goes with art. So it's the enjoyment of looking at it. It's the enjoyment of meeting people who are creative and create this art in front of you. It's the enjoyment of learning about it. It's the enjoyment
of sharing
discussing
it as well. Right.
and it's the enjoyment of sharing it. Because in the end, no art should exist, in a kind of monastery, although it's all right in a monastery if you can go and visit, but it should really be shared by all. This is why I personally love museums. I love museums when they don't charge people because I think access should be free. But I also think that even private collections should be open collections. I mean, art is something for everybody to enjoy, to appreciate, and to learn from. So art is not just a question of having something on your wall, but it's all the feeling that goes with it, a Gesamtkunsterfahrung.
When we come back, Zaki tells us about the various stages of being an art collector and what it means to him. We will also take some questions from the audience. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're listening to the Lighthouse Conversations and our live episode with Minister of State Zaki Nusseibeh. Before the break, Zaki was telling us about the impact art had on him, the overall experience, which is in German named Gesamtkunsterfahrung, and why he feels all art should be public.
I mean, I again think that art speaks to you, and you cannot just enjoy everything, and you do not react in the same way to everything that you see. And of course, I went through several phases. First, when you enjoy art, you enjoy everything.
Sure.
I mean, I remember as a schoolboy, I was still at rugby school in England, and I went to Paris, maybe 16, maybe 15. And my sister was studying at the École des Beaux-Arts as a painter herself. And I remember in those days, the Impressionist art was in the museum called Jeu de Paume, which was in the Jardin des Tuileries. Now it has the Monet Water Lilies series, but then it was Impressionist and it was Rodin, the thinker and the kiss. And I remember when I saw those in Paris, it just blew my mind. And from then, you go to enjoy all kinds of arts. I mean, in London was beautiful. Cambridge had, of course, the Fitzwilliam Museum, which had everything from Rembrandt to Rubens.
And when you transition to look at Arab art.
But this is what I want to say. So this is the first phase, is when you go and look and enjoy art and you try to learn about art generally. And then when you start wanting to have your own collection, I mean, I initially went for Orientalists. And in those days, I'm talking about the 60s, it was not expensive. And I collected some because I wanted to have around me some art that, is related to my region and an art that speaks to me. And then was taken up by modern Middle East art. So I sold when it became, because it becomes actually, when art becomes so expensive, it's almost obscene. I mean, I don't think that I think art should always remain accessible to people. So anyway, I sold what I had and I started buying modern and contemporary Middle East or Menasa, if you like, art. And of course, since coming here, this has been really my focus, is to get art from Menasa, from the region, from starting with the Gulf, with the Emirates, with the region, with the Middle East, but with India, Southeast Asia, to look at art that talks to us. And the UAE, as you know, has 200 nationalities that live and work and create creatively, live together here. And so you have all of this to talk to you. And this is really my focus now. It's
Have
this
you
kind of
found
art.
anything particular that speaks to you within? I mean, it's now a larger body of work in terms of both modern and contemporary art in the Middle East. I mean, for example, I find myself drawn to particular eras. Some cases, the pre-67 era in Egypt, for example. Maybe it's nostalgic. I'm not sure. Maybe it's freezing certain memories. But have you found in your sort of interest a particular era or line speaking to you?
For me, I look at the whole sweep of this art development from modern. Well, there's Egypt, of course. We have some great artists. Iraq, of course, that has some great artists. Syria, and we notice that a great deal of this art is started being based on calligraphy, hurufiyat, using the letters of the alphabet, initially as sentences and subsequently as abstract and conceptual. But it's all in one way or another a reflection on our social mores, on our history. So a lot of it is political, and I cannot say that I like one phase more than the other. I whether you get a Gergesian in order to look at the ideas of the Trinity and motherhood and sadness, or like Ayali, those hauntingly lonely individuals, whether it's a little girl or a player or an instrument player, or Hazem Harb, when he goes and looks at those old, posters of Palestinian innocence, and then superimposes things on them. So I cannot say one phase and not the other, but a lot of it, I would say, Iranian art. I mean, if you have Farhad Mushiri, these classical jazz that are both part of our heritage because it's classical, it has poetry. Normally, he writes poetry on it. And then you read something like the one particular one I love is where it's a woman who says, or it's a woman who puts her head on his shoulder, weeping, saying, "I love you no more." And you want to know, if she doesn't love him no more, why is she weeping and why is her head on? That kind, it talks to you.
Sure.
Muhammad Qazem, some of his latest series about the conditions of labor in the Emirates. I mean, these dark shadows that you do not see because they're out of the light. Hassan Sharif and his, almost crazy ideas
Very
that he
conceptual.
has been able to develop from the 80s and are now recognized
Being
as some of
recognized
the
more
research.
lately, yes.
So all of this is interesting for me in equal terms.
And how do you connect these dots in terms of your own interests? Because I know you read a lot. You've also taught yourself many languages, right? How many languages, just for the record?
Seven.
Seven. I can only test you on four, but anyway, I'm going to. So how do you connect these dots? Because I think it's also a very important consideration when we think about, students and children today growing up, and how do we build all of the ecosystem together? Because it's not one or the other. It's not
You know
alone to
what
just have
makes
art.
us
You have
human,
to have all these
in
pieces. How do you
fact,
connect those
is
dots?
our propensity to tell stories and to enjoy storytelling. So, from being a baby, how does a baby learn? A baby learns by listening to stories and sounds. So everything connects. The language is sound. This is what makes us human beings. It gives us language, and then it gives us the ability to be storytellers, weavers of dreams, and then those dreams become our own. So if you start reading, and I mean, as children, when we start reading those stories, whether it's Alice in Wonderland or uh, you start having images in your own mind about the events that take place, about Red Riding Hood and that bad wolf that's, and then from those images, your mind grows. You develop. This is a gift that we are endowed with. It's genetically embedded in us, where storytelling is the way that our lives grow, and we're able to branch out, to learn, to absorb, from music to art to storytelling to poetry to architecture, enjoying nature, to enjoying the sound of water spring, or the sound of birds. All of this is storytelling. I mean, we really are humans in that we are storytellers, and that we really learn by listening to stories or recounting those stories. Now, an artist would tell you a story. Chopin will tell you a story through his music. Faust would tell you, Goethe would tell you a story through his theater, and so forth. This is the connecting, I believe personally, and this is how I brought up my children, always to induce in them very young, as children, the love. And I'm sure all parents do this with their children. They induce in their children storytelling. I mean, you interest your child in life by telling him a story or her a
100%.
story, and then you induce them to read because you want them to enjoy this storytelling and to weave their own dreams, or to enjoy the weaving of dreams by others. I mean, you saw the findings that were made recently about rock art in Australia. 44,000 years ago, and this is when man was pre-Neolithic, I don't know what they are, or Paleolithic, or whatever term there is, but this is 44,000 years ago, when that man was still a hunter-gatherer, so agriculture has not developed, and yet they spent all their time scavenging for food, and yet they were able to draw these designs on walls, and 44,000 years ago, of animals that had human heads. And obviously, again, it's a way of telling a story. So there is a need, there is an embedded need in our genetic
And
makeup.
obviously, some of the art you spoke about earlier are also artists wanting to tell their own story. I mean, Hazem is a case in point, but wanting to tell their story, or at least appropriate the narrative for themselves and tell a version of that story.
And I think every form of art is storytelling, whether it's music, whether it's a novel, whether in a novel, in a poem, every work of art, every creative work of art is in fact telling of a story.
So, what can parents and teachers and others do to promote that type of storytelling? Because when you look at today's curriculum, and I'm not talking about the UE necessarily, cross, sometimes you find those things lacking, and these things are also taught in isolation as opposed to being connected. What do you think can be done about that?
The first thing is take away all these iPads and
It's a tall order. It's
the
going to
tall
be
order.
difficult.
I mean, iPads become very useful at some stage, and these games, these electronic games, because I think the first duty of any parent really is, I believe, through storytelling, to really inspire the child's imagination, because it's the imagination that makes a child grow. So you need to really inspire, you need to fire that imagination. And you can only do this through inducing into the young children this love for storytelling, story reading, and not show them films of. I mean, I'll tell you, for instance, Lord of the Rings. When you read a story to children, you give them one kind of ability to imagine what is happening, but you show them the cartoon, and suddenly there is no imagination because everything
They're
is
relying
put
on it.
before them. So it's really, how do you inspire, enrich a child's imagination? I mean, my children I used to take to school and recount stories to them like 1,001 Nights, ending every time at a cliffhanger, so that they will be waiting for me to
For the
come and
next
take
night.
them back
That's
to
brilliant.
continue with that story. And there are so many stories to tell children. And then as they grow, I believe the importance of letting them, visit museums and listen to music, and this is one of the great things that the leadership here has accomplished, is to begin opening all these museums around us. Because a child that goes to a school and learns in a curriculum about culture or art is not a full student. He must go to a museum, he must see things, and he must really enjoy them. Uh, and teachers, well, this is bring culture, art, teach children how to really, again, enrich the imagination. Always the question of enriching a person's imagination.
To that point about culture production here in the UAE, as you said, the first chapter was obviously building the infrastructure. Many museums have opened, art galleries. That was top down for the most part. And now you're seeing also over the last 10 years, let's say, a bottom up movement as well. Several movements, Al Cirkel, Minam is with us here, and others have really spearheaded this movement that's more organic. And there's an interplay between the top down government led and the organic. How does that play out going forward?
Okay, I think to begin with, I mean, let's just to put something out of into context, that there was always also organic social involvement in art. I
Sure.
mean, so when we talk about for instance, the Hassan Jarif group that in the 80s created a society, Sand Castle, that met together with poets, and they included poets and painters. So there was always a social, organic, if you like, movement. Uh, but of course, in a place like the UAE, which really started on a marvelous journey 50 years ago, I always tell people who come to visit here, you need to look at a record of what existed 50 years ago to see and to appreciate what was accomplished in such a short span of time. And it's not a question of oil money, because oil is abundant in Libya, and oil is in Iraq, and oil is in Nigeria. So it's a number of things that work
No, there has to be
together,
a will and an interest.
and good governance, and passionate leadership, and responsible, leaders with the sense of responsibility and so forth. But the basic, I would say, first 40 years were focused on building the infrastructures that were badly needed, including roads. I mean, the airport in Dubai, the first one I came to, was a small building where you could see it, you walk from one end to the other, and you look at Dubai's airport today. But at the same time, the next, if you like, phase of development is one where the focus is really on education, creating a society of knowledge, and culture as an integral part of education. And this is where you need governments from up downwards to invest.
Mm.
And this has happened, throughout history. So the great collections of the world, whether it's in Florence or in Venice or in Paris, they were all started by either royal families or leaders or emperors. And this is something that the government in the UAE is doing now. I mean, in Sharjah, they've been doing it since the 90s of the last century, with the Biennale that has taken off as an amazing landmark, international, on the global art scene. The museums, 24 museums. And then the big museums that in Abu Dhabi were envisaged within the cultural center on Saadiyat. I mean, a really major, major investment. And that has brought in true international global awareness of the region in terms of art and culture. So whereas I would say in the first, art in the West was always considered from a Western centric perspective, that is something that develops in Paris and London and Los Angeles, but nothing possible in Cairo or New Delhi. Or Now that perspective has changed. All these directors of museums who come here have seen that there is an exciting, robust, an imaginative art, both modern and contemporary, here and in the region, because the Emirates straddles a wide strategic, and therefore there is the interest from global. But then this is not enough, as you said, because in the end, the only way it becomes alive is when from bottom, from society itself, the social entrepreneurs
People take
also
initiative.
come in. And this is something that Al Serkal has done in a major way. And, really kudos to him. And because he created a cultural hub that is independent of government control in the heart of the city. And it has become internationally recognized. He had a Bauhaus building that nearly won the Aga Khan
Prize.
prize. Galleries that have opened. Now, here, what is happening in Dubai is particularly exciting because I think traditionally, Dubai was always had a stronger entrepreneurial community. Abu Dhabi was more government and is more government fixated, but it's a good,
Sure,
if you like,
it's a good balance as well.
complementarity.
Yeah,
Abu
absolutely.
Dhabi can invest in those big museums that we are having, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the Zayed National Museum, later perhaps the Maritime. And, to have a museum of universal stature like the Louvre is not a small
No.
achievement. And this drives also the cultural scene, but it also drives social community to become more involved because bureaucrats are never good cultural czars. You need the local community to become the real actors. And we have that. I mean, we're beginning to have this, but I still believe that it is important for governments to invest. I mean, even today, people don't realize that 80% of museums in the world were built past 1980. So big cities in the world go on
Recognize that. Absolutely.
recognizing that we
Absolutely.
need to spend on culture. Unfortunately, when you have now government budgets and accountants who want to save money, sometimes they forget that investing in culture is long term, but it is a major driver for sustainable development.
It was truly inspiring getting Minister Zaki's perspective on how the region continues to build its own narrative and use its rich history as a launching pad. We also received some interesting questions from the audience. For example, one member of the audience wanted to know how Sheikh Zayed acted as a patron for arts and culture, even beyond the borders of the UAE.
In 1969, as an example, but after that, Sheikh Zayed used to go to Geneva. We used to go to Geneva. He would spend the summer and he would spend the time there. And the first time, I mean, and he loved seeing it because it was beautiful, of course, nature, which he loved, the water, the green. And the first thing he said there is to bring a team of performers to the University of Geneva. There was a professor, he knew of the region, Simon Jargi. Simon Jargi. And so I got to know him. And then we brought over a whole team of Ayale dancing and music players, and they performed on the stage at the University of Geneva. And I remember bringing them with me. They were very young performers. And as we drove from airport in a bus into Geneva, one of them told me, I read a lot of description of heaven in the Quran, and now that I see this around me, I can see what heaven is like. And interestingly, Sheikh Zayed then created the same kind of lake with a water spring that comes from the middle in Al Ain near Al Mubazzara. But so for Sheikh Zayed, he was always interested in showing what we had as a cultural heritage everywhere he went. In 1969 again, and before we had infrastructure in Al Ain, he asked us to build the first museum, archaeological museum, which stands there today, although it's being renovated now, in order to show the archaeological finds from Healy and Nar about the communities who lived here 4 and 5,000 years ago, traded with the Indus Valley, with Mesopotamia, created beautiful pottery. He wanted to tell a story, and the story is about the people of the UAE. Do not come here just thinking this is an oil patch, it has discovered oil, and therefore there is no history, or there is no heritage, or there is no tradition. So Sheikh Zayed was very keen on making sure that our heritage and our traditions live with us, and then that we also expose them to the world that is coming to either live with us or work here.
Another one asked him what kind of stories Minister Zaki himself is drawn to and what role storytelling plays in forming an identity.
Very, very good questions. Of course, what is storytelling to me? What kind of storytelling? My whole life is built, if you like, around storytelling. So I look at everything in terms of a story that is either being recounted to me or of something that I am trying to read, whether that is in going to a Wagner opera, to the Ring, or going to a theater, going to the Globe and listening to Shakespeare, reading a novel, reading a poem. Everything for me tells me a story. And it goes through my mind the whole time. When I try to sleep at night, I go through a storytelling phase in order to go to sleep. So everything to me I go through is a question of storytelling. Even films I see, I try to make into a story, then live through them. And I believe that this is really, really the secret of our, if you like, being enthralled by anything we go to, whether it's a film or a theater or an opera or reading a novel or even reading science fiction that I really am also passionate about. But we don't realize that it's storytelling. But this is the way that our imagination is nourished. Now, what about identities? Identities, of course, are important. And through reading, we talked about heritage. And we talked about the need to keep your social roots, your heritage, your traditions. But there is always a thin line and the dangerous one between identity as part of an enriching, uh, overall component of your personality, or as a debilitating one, because it pushes you into a bubble that then seeks to isolate itself from the other, or starts to look askance as the other, or disrespect for the other. So, how can we manage to have an identity that is important, a Palestinian? I mean, they ask me, what do you feel yourself as an identity? And I say, I'm an Emirati who is born in Jerusalem. I spent all my life and all my work in the Emirates, and I am born in Jerusalem and have family traditions that go back there 1500 years. And that is easy when you look at it as something that is complementing each other. It becomes dangerous when you fox yourself into saying, I am a Shiite, or I am a Durzi, or I am simply in the different sects, a Maronite, an Orthodox, a Catholic. And I think this is the dangerous line that we seek. Identity seeking is important, but at the same time, we need always to learn how to be open to the others. And interestingly enough, you can only do this when you are confident of your own identity.
I'm just going to interject, and the story you told us at the beginning is so telling. The fact that essentially a Muslim family was holding custody to the keys of a holy church in Jerusalem. So that's sort of again another story and
So
very
it's an
telling about.
identity of, you have the two, the identities
Yeah.
can become, Amin Maruf called them the deadly identities in one of his books, because this is what led Lebanon into the civil war and is leading Lebanon, into the nightmare that it has been. Lebanon is a country really, for all those who knew it, and I knew it in the 60s when it was, we called it the Paris, the Switzerland of the Middle East. We went there to buy books in the bookshops and to meet the writers and the poets and political parties of all hues. And yet, as they started bringing themselves more and more narrowly into their own identities, it was a path to disaster. So we have to keep this balance between the two.
And lastly, a young member of the audience wanted to know what advice Zaki had for aspiring journalists.
As a journalist, I think The first thing is to be passionate about your work, because you are telling a story. And, human nature is all about telling a story. And journalists are people who go out in order to report on things happening, whether it's in politics or in economics or in history, and they tell a story. And then, of course, to be literate. I mean, you need to develop your linguistic abilities to the extent where you can express yourself in the best forms that are available to you. And then you have to become knowledgeable about anything you want to work with. And that means really reading up regularly. I used to tell my daughters when they were at school, read The Economist every week, read Newsweek and Times, and you will keep abreast of what's happening around the world. So you have to read and to be knowledgeable about everything you do. And then you have to network, because journalism depends on networking. You have to have your sources, you have to have your access, you have to have the trust and confidence of people who are in charge. Develop all of those together, and you will become a great journalist. Technology should not be used as a shortcut. Read the serious, I mean, take a newspaper, the Independent, the Guardian, the Times, any of those papers, the New York Times, and a great paper. Take a magazine, Newsweek and Time, and The Economist. Take a Times literary supplement. Learn about new books. You really need to read. In order to be a journalist, you really to read and read and read. A, that improves your own language. B, it teaches you how to express yourself, because there is a style for journalism, how to produce a paragraph, where to start it with, how to end your paragraph. And then knowledge and networking.
I think on that note, we'll have to end it. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for coming today and for joining us. Many more stories to tell. So inshallah, there'll be a sequel
Well,
soon.
thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. As always, thank you for joining us on the episode of The Lighthouse Conversations, with me, Hashim Montasser, as your host. The Lighthouse Conversations is produced by Chirag Desai. You can listen to all our episodes for free in your favorite podcast player and on the web at thelighthouse.ae/podcast.